Thank you all for coming again. Really, it's great. So yeah, I wrote this book and it took me, I say decades, it's kind of the polite way of saying a really long time. I started it actually when I was in college. I felt exiled, but that's not really true. I was in northwestern Massachusetts, and it's lush, and it's green, and it's cloudy, and it drizzles a lot, and you can't see, and you climb up a mountain, and I would be like, where's the chainsaw? I need to be able to see. I can't even, it's just like you climb to the top and you're just looking at more trees, right? And maybe you can see a little bit through the trees. So one day when I was particularly homesick and sad, I was up on a slight rise on the campus and I could see some sky, and I can remember the moment. I'm sure it wasn't divine, but it was definitely, I was told, you will go to Colorado and this summer. And at the same time, I had always carried with me this curiosity about the Elkhead Rock Schoolhouse, which is a landmark and is a white elephant, is a lot of things, you might say. But you get up there and you're in the oak brush and the sagebrush, and all of a sudden there's this massive 2-story solid rock school that was also a high school. And growing up with my grandparents, had a ranch here in the Yampa Valley, there were various pieces of stories about that. But I realized that, my grandfather was a wonderful storyteller, but sometimes factual might not be exactly right. And he was an entertaining storyteller, and an engaging one, and a funny one, and often self-deprecating one. But sometimes he missed big chunks, So at that moment, standing on that little patch of dry ground on this campus, I thought, I'm going to go and try to find everybody that knows anything about the Elkhead School. And that's really where this started, was a rural history project. And my grandparents were wonderfully helpful because they'd been involved in the school, and both my grandmothers, I wasn't in a polygamous family, but I had 2 grandmothers that my grandfather married Eunice Pleasant, and then she died just a year or 2 after I was born, and then he remarried Rosamond Underwood Perry Carpenter, who has all sorts of connections here in Steamboat. And I grew up thinking she was my grandmother. I knew I had a Grandma Eunice, but I also had a Grandma Roz. And fortunately, I was not alone, because the cousins on that side said they never figured out that Grandpa Ferry was not actually their biological grandpa. So we were a big mush. Thank goodness for these wonderful grandparents that didn't distinguish between who was who. We were just all grandkids. So Grandma Roz had been, you probably all know that one of the, or maybe you don't, you don't need to know, but she'd been the first teacher at the Rock Schoolhouse. And she had kept in touch with families, and she had been best friends with my Grandma Eunice, who named her oldest daughter after my mother. Things were entwined. So, and people kept in touch, because every time, it's interesting to look at my grandmother Eunice's letters. One of the things she sent to my mother while my mother was in college was a picture of a graduating high school senior who was the daughter of one of her students at the Rock Schoolhouse. So that was an enormous achievement, and they sent their former teacher the picture, right? And so people knew where each other were. And from Vernal to Denver we traveled all over the place, a couple of friends and myself, interviewing people who had gone to, or been part of the Elkhead Schoolhouse. That was in 1973. That was a long time ago. It was a ton of fun, and then I was frankly absolutely choked with information. I had transcripts, and I had tapes, and I had photographs, and I had all these people writing me with, all high hopes about how I would make sense of all this. And I was 19 years old, and, I was like, ah! But eventually I did write my doctoral dissertation on the school and on kind of the idea of place-based education, which it wasn't called then, and on consolidation, which obviously affected Routt County and Moffat County, most of the western counties a lot, where these small schools were closed and kids were bused into a central school, which was a very tragic, at that time, undertaking. And it pretty much, well, economic forces were undercutting Elkhead at that time, but then losing their school just really capped them at the knees. So that's where this book began, and took a lot of winding paths since that time. But I think the thing that kept me trying to understand this was partly this incredible sentiment and nostalgia that people who had been part of this community felt. They all really wanted to bear down on me and tell me this was a community. This was real neighborliness. This is where if you had something extra that you weren't using, you gave it to somebody else. This is where, or it was where, if somebody needed a hand, you worked with them, and then they helped you. And just all of this very powerful sense of loss of that community that just kind of fascinated me. I mean, and I realized that in my own life, even though the Elkheaders continued to get together through the 50s, 60s, 70s, we still get together to play music and dance. Not in the rock schoolhouse anymore, but in this pink, we call it the Pink School, but it's down in the valley. So I had experienced some of that, all night dancing, angel food cakes at midnight. You know, and us kids were trying out 7 different angel food cakes, and people are hovering around us to see which one we prefer, you know. Of course, we were just eating them, gobbling them up. We weren't gourmands or anything. But anyhow, I had experienced a piece of that, but I'd never lived in that kind of environment. So that became a drive for me to try to explore that, and how did that happen, how did it form? And frankly, that's what led me also, so I had what I called it, you know, kind of sarcastically, a courtesy chapter about the Ute. Because, you know, I didn't want to write about this place without acknowledging the presence of the Ute and the powerful connections that they had. But I began to, in conversations with just an absolutely wonderful woman in the Ute tribe in Fort Duchesne, I started realizing that part of their sense of the past and what they were holding on to was a sense of community. And part of what they were struggling with in their interface with European, whatever we want to call our capitalistic culture, was a misunderstanding particularly about why kids weren't more ambitious. She was an educator, but she said, you'll ask a classroom full of kids on the Ute Nation a question, and nobody will raise their hand because they don't want to stick out. They don't want to show that they're smarter than the other kid. They want to work together. And she said it frustrates people so much. And I was just like fascinated by that and by their sense of property. Like when I started looking into the documents so one of the things that happened to most Native American tribes was a process called allotment, which was a nice word, you know, post-treaty to just take more land. So they said, oh, you are now eligible as a U.S. citizen and you can homestead on your own reservation, but you can pick 160 acres. Or if you only want 80, that's fine with us. But be sure not to take any of the good water or be down here along the streams, you know. So this was called allotment. And the Utes resisted this. They pulled up surveying stakes. They fled to South Dakota to try to join with the Sioux to fight allotment. And one of the things they said was, why would you ever want to live in a pen? You know, like be fenced in. They just had never experienced that sense of property. And I just found that so interesting. All of these conflicts that are underneath the colonialist conflict, right? A whole different conception of who you are and who you are as an individual versus who you are as a member of a group. And it was almost so big in their lives that when I said, you know, your sense of community really interests me, one woman, Betsy Chapu, said to me, community? Well, what are you talking about? You know, we have a reservation here. She immediately interpreted it as a geographic description, not as a belonging description. So earlier iterations of this book were about, the title was Belonging, one title that I went through, and Togetherness, or something around being together and the sense of being, your life being intimately connected to other people's life. So that's, I guess you'd say, the theme of this book is the formation and sustenance of a community, or the inheritance of one and the loss of one. I mean, those things happen all at the same time. But I thought today, I kind of wanted to try out something on you, which has been bothering me or intriguing me or something since I wrote this book, which is what happened? How did we lose that? Like, we're such social people, and we all grew up. I mean, well, our ancestors grew up, we assume, I mean, I think most people would know, we grew up belonging in a group, belonging in a tribe or a clan or I don't even know a particular place, but we, you know, humans, that's the way humans have lived for a long, long, long time. And so what snapped that? You know, where did we head off into this individualistic stuff? And I just wanted to share. After college, I was a Watson Traveling Fellow, which was an enormous honor, and it was a chance to travel. And I spent a lot of time in India, and I've been there many times, and I just found it home-like. You know, I mean, it was like people were living in, I don't know, it just felt familiar, you know, start a fire, cook, take care of people. I don't know, it was a homey kind of place. And I remember flying back into New York City and getting on the subway, you know, on my way probably to sleep on somebody's couch or something. And I sat there and I looked around at all the people on the subway. And I had this, like, it wasn't an hallucination or apparition or something, it was just this sense that everybody was made out of wax. They were all sitting there, enclosed in their own being. Nobody was talking to anybody. Nobody was touching anybody. And I'd come from this culture where you rarely saw someone alone. And if they were alone, they were on their way to another group, right? I mean, you know, the connections between people were so intense in India. And it's not just because it's a very densely populated, or certainly the cities are very densely populated, but even the small towns can feel densely populated. Because, I mean, you can look out on a street and think, is there a parade? You know, because so many people are out and about and with each other and in clumps. And it just, I came back into the US and I was like, what happened? You know, all these lonely, solitary people sitting in their own little space, you know. And of course at that point, you know, being just out of college, I thought, probably Freud, you know, he messed us up good. You know, I mean, it's just like, you know, get into your inner self and think about what you're doing, and, you know, all this introspection stuff that came out of that whole psychoanalytic tradition. That's what I thought then. But so I kind of want to, I've been thinking about this pretty much all summer and last spring. Like, was it capitalism that needed us to have property, like with boundaries, and it's mine, mine, mine? And I started thinking about all the things that we think we own, right? We own our vehicles, we own our clothes, we own our property, we own our money, we own our ideas, we own our books, we own, in a way we own our children, you know, that's my child. We just have, it's just crept into, and our sense of prosperity has become so individualistic. You know, I'm doing better this year, I did worse last year, you know, I've got to work my way around the IRS or whatever, and then I'll even be better off, or I'll be able to buy I always call them Swifters, but I get corrected, they're Sprinters. My brother was an early Sprinter adopter, and I was like, what a nice Swifter you've got. And he was like furious with me. But anyway, you know, you even own your own well-being, right? You know, are you taking care of yourself? Have you been to yoga? You know, or whatever it is, you know, physical therapist. Are you taking, during a really awful divorce, I can't tell you how many people said to me, Belle, don't forget to take care of yourself. And I'm like, you're my friend. That's what I need, you know? I don't need to go soak in a bathtub or something. I mean, not that soaking in bathtubs isn't helpful, but so that how all of that stuff that's gotten part of our sense of who we are and where we are. And I don't know, you can't blame capitalism on all of it. Western culture, but this whole idea of ownership I think is really fascinating. And when you start hearing it, it doesn't matter where you are. Steamboat, Hayden, Craig, Denver, you know, where you are, you'll start hearing this sense of ownership all the time. You know, my tree, my lawn, my car, so on. And I think that collective ownership and collective responsibility and your well-being is as important as mine, or the well-being of our whole family or our whole extended group is vital, you know? And I'm not going to brag about what I have that you don't have, because what I have is actually yours too. But you know, and how radical that sounds. The other thing that I think has happened, and I mean, this is just me, and I mean, I sound probably kind of evangelical, but I think we've started being really suspicious about caring and empathy. It's like, if you take care of somebody, are you making them a dependent? Is that a moral hazard that they won't learn how to take care of themselves? You know, it's like, it's a weird thing that's trickled in, like, and maybe some of it's just simply misogynistic, you know, that women have been the caretakers and men supposedly, I mean, I'm talking stereotypes right now. I know the perfectly nice men out there somewhere. You know, the idea of being altruistic, being generous, caring, extending yourself, even when you're not asked and when you can't expect anything in return. Like, I mean, I've had, what's in it for me? Well, goodness, I don't know. You know, it's just how you treat other people. And I think there's just this little kind of hesitancy that we've worked in about taking care of one another. And that is also undermines this idea of community. If you think of yourself as needing to be, I don't know, constantly pumped up, you know, then the error that you might give somebody else would take away from yours, right? That being generous will somehow disable the other person, that they won't fend for themselves, right? The codependency thing, or works its way into all kinds of conversations about why is it that you wouldn't take someone else's well-being as important as your own? Not to the point of starvation, but you would maybe split what you have with someone else, that you care about, and especially children. So that was the other thing that shows up in both, in Elkhead, was just this real, I can't quite say it. I mean, it's probably very familiar in other cultures where kids and their well-being is just paramount. It overcomes everything, right? I mean, you give all that you have, you create the best world that you can for your kids. And that underlies the story of the Rock Schoolhouse, interestingly enough. They really, I don't think there were about 1 or 2 people who had finished high school in this homesteading community. I mean, they wouldn't have been homesteading if they hadn't been desperate. I mean, if they'd been doing fine in the Midwest or wherever they came from, they wouldn't have gone out in the sagebrush and oak brush and said, oh, let's make a nice life out here. I mean, there was a level of poverty that is striking, and there have been people who told me that they really kind of got hungry while they were reading my book because people did not have enough food, and children died of starvation. And that was one of the reasons to build the school, was it was long before free and reduced lunch, but they provided breakfast and lunch for kids because the teachers saw them coming with a pancake, but it was really flour and water slathered with lard, and that was considered a really high-end lunch, right? So providing some nutrition was part of the school's thing. But the idea of gathering and being together so that you have time to see how others are doing. And of course, the other people that everyone was always worried about were single men, because as in our culture now, I mean, it continues. They're the violent ones, and on the whole, nothing. I mean, it's just like if you're gonna, in a small, tight community, it's often the women who are talking to one another and making all the social arrangements and so on. But the people that were kind of on the fringes and sometimes like barreling off into the extreme fringes were often single men. And, people had very simplistic ideas about that then, that the problem was they needed to find a wife, right? And then their mental health would improve, which was probably true, but so one terrible thing happened in this community that shook everyone pretty much for the rest of their lives, was a single guy who had left Missouri, a large family, no land, lots of brothers, kind of a classic, pitched out, we can't divide this land anymore, you're on your own, bud. And he went down to Ouray and he worked in the silver mines, and he didn't really get along with anybody. And then he found a guy working in the silver mines who was actually over here in Deep Creek, Vail, V-A-I-L-E. And he said, oh, there's plenty of land up here in northwest Colorado. So this character, James Oldham, came up, and he was one of the very first homesteaders in the Elkhead area. And he grabbed some water and some bottom land and some, a pretty decent ranch. And he was raising Timothy seed, and he was doing okay, kind of. And then failed romance. I mean, anyway, we're not sure all that happened to him, but he started getting crazier and crazier and crazier. And the more neighbors that came in around him, the more paranoid he got. to the point where he thought people were putting dead calves in his ditch to poison him. He thought that he could see gun barrels sticking out of his haystack and thought people were, following him. He just started, he didn't even trust the doctor because he thought the doctor was mixing medicines to try to poison him. Things got worse and worse and worse, and there was a large family, Maya's family. The Fultons ended up homesteading on both sides of this guy, and there were 3 brothers, but 2 were on each side of him, and another one was up on the mesa. And, they were, doing their own thing. And he just started going nuts about the Fultons, and there were all kinds of altercations. And then he went to a school board meeting down on Dry Fork, which was in a little log cabin, and the minutes are in here. It's a pretty normal school board meeting. And he got up and started shooting people, primarily Fultons. He killed, I don't know if it's your great-great-uncle,
It would have
Cliff.
it would have been my great-uncle.
Yeah, and wounded probably another uncle, Charles, and several other people who tried to stop him, and they did eventually stop him. There wasn't any cell phone to call, or, sheriff was probably in Steamboat somewhere. I think actually when the sheriff did come, they came by train to Hayden and then by horseback the 10 miles because they kept this guy, hog-tied was the polite term, on the ground until they came in. And then they took the train back and put him in jail in Steamboat. But the case went on for ages because it was, these ironies, prior to this shooting and murder and wounding of severely wounding others, everyone in the community decided he was mentally ill. And they'd actually gotten an expert witness from Denver to testify that he was mentally ill. And he had denied it all the way through. So then he goes to court, and his lawyers are trying to say, the insanity defense, and he's like, no way. Perfectly justified in doing what I did. I'd do it again. Those crazy people. And that they were a gang. That was the other kind of thing that started working up in his imagination, was that everyone was against him. Anyway, this was a jolt in May 1914 that just horrified people, partly because, for many, many reasons, and personally, they felt very threatened by having this guy around, but also because, in a tiny community that is just pulling itself together and growing, a murder would scare people off, right? And so they wanted to have a picture of prosperity and harmonious and, so forth. And this just sliced right into it. So it was actually very soon after that murder that the idea of this school as a community center, getting back to this idea of single men, that you would have a place where everyone could gather. And gather they did, Thanksgiving. Christmas was at the schoolhouse. Nobody had their own private celebration. The tree was at the schoolhouse. Santa Claus was at the schoolhouse. All the presents were given out at the schoolhouse. And an all-night dance and party. Christmas was at the schoolhouse. Valentine's Day. Everything, anytime that they could make an excuse almost. My grandfather was famous for his birthday on August 10th. It was come one, come all. That would be in the newspaper.
Wow.
The Pilot, the Hayden Rapp County Republican, the Craig paper, come celebrate. And the very first one he did was probably the most famous one because he had the first flush toilet in Rapp County. and people came to flush the toilet and try it out. And apparently there were lines, over 100 people showed up to see this marvel of, sanitation or something. But he was someone who loved to party. But the community had this sense that they needed a center, they needed a place where they could fold people in and know people and maybe get some help before things went completely awry like they did for Oldham. And indeed it didn't happen. And indeed it wasn't that many years later, the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic hit this country in early 1920. It was on the third or fourth wave that it really hit Rock County. And that's when all the schools were closed and the churches were not allowed to meet and no clubs were allowed to meet. I mean, they didn't do it like Gunnison and close off the roads. I couldn't believe that. I mean, they actually put roadblocks. You couldn't get into Gunnison or out of Gunnison. They got through the pandemic because with only one young person dying, which was, and no antibiotics, right? Certainly no Tamiflu or whatever that, antiviral stuff going. They closed things down, but people just were so accustomed to going and cooking and washing and cleaning and taking care of one another. And the word went out, don't do chores. Because what was happening was in the wintertime, young people whose parents were sick would say, okay, I'll do the feeding, I'll, take care of the chickens, I'll milk the cows, I'll do this. And they would die overnight. I mean, that flu makes COVID look like mild, I mean, there's some amazing stories of people. There's one hilarious but tragic story of a group getting together in a bar here to play cards, 4 of them, and they were all dead by the next morning.
Wow.
So this moral message, that you shouldn't be playing cards and drinking and see what'll happen to you. But anyway, I think so there was a practical side to this caring and connectedness that it kept people going. And it kept people going when probably long before their homestead was actually viable. So another story that I was told by the daughter and son of some homesteaders up there who really had a miserable time and whose father had borrowed money and then gone way into debt after World War I, when everyone was encouraged to borrow and expand, the Fergusons, and he had borrowed $25,000 against a 160-acre homestead right up near the Rock Schoolhouse. It's just all brush. I mean, they had a tiny spring. And that he just disappeared, and they found out he'd walked to Oak Creek and then to Bonn, gotten on a train, and the next thing they knew he was in Umatilla, Washington, wherever that is. So people were under a lot of strain. But that same family told me that there were a family, Myrtle Davis, and there was a distinctions made. I mean, I don't want to over-romanticize things because people made distinctions about where you were from and how well you were educated, and there were class distinctions and also ethnic distinctions that people made. If you came from Russia and you were Jewish, well, that was brought up right away. That's Isidore Bolton, and he's from Russia and he's Jewish. Everything was right up front. But a lot of people came from Arkansas, including some sharecropping families whose kids had never been in school. And so it was kind of a marvel to them. But Myrtle Davis had, I don't know how many boys, just a whole passel of boys. And her husband was making a living as hauling freight from here to Rollins. And so she was on her own. But she was known and sort of looked down upon because she chewed tobacco. And she, according to her neighbors, spent money that should have been spent on staples on tobacco. But she was also a crack shot. And so she, according to the Ferguson kids, who certainly would have known, she would come up from her homestead, find the kids, and tell them, there's a pretty down in the spring for you. And that meant a whole venison. that she would just leave it there for them, dressed meat. We leave it for them in the spring. I mean, it kind of gross when you think about it being in spring. But if you don't have a refrigerator, that's probably a good place to keep meat. And her parents were like, Leela and Dick's parents didn't really want their kids to be associating with this woman because she was pretty coarse in a way. But on the other hand, she was keeping them alive, right? She was keeping those kids alive. I mean, that's the same Richard is the one who told me that during the pandemic, during the winter of 1919-1920, the snow was terrible. There was a blockade at Corona Pass. The trains weren't coming through, weren't getting food, they weren't getting hay, and people were losing their stock. And he said, I was shaving aspen bark off trees to feed to my cattle, so that we wouldn't lose them all. But they lost them all anyway. So it's survival, maybe that helps people take care of one another, but it takes some feeling like my good fortune isn't just mine without your well-being, right? If we're gonna be in this together, we're kind of in it together. Anyway, I just want to throw that out. That's just a completely half-baked, unseasoned, as we say, line of thinking. Like, what happened to us that we got convinced of being so precious and perfect and individual, and that we couldn't share without wondering whether it was a good idea or not. I don't know. Okay. I guess underlying a lot of this is just the knowledge people had then that life was a struggle. It didn't owe you really anything. It didn't help to complain. And I think the Utes had the same idea. They just didn't sit around saying, oh, this is terrible. We don't have any choke cherries this year. Just went and found some sarvice berries. I don't know. But it wasn't this feeling of being a grievance and a struggle. That was not the story that people told us when we were interviewing them. That's not the stories that they published in the newspaper. And some of it was glorifying. They're trying to say, oh, aren't we great? And come on and have a homestead up here and join us, But some of it was just an attitude about life, that life isn't easy and will be a struggle, and we're in this together. All right, I'm going to end with, and I'd love questions. Just one thing that I have learned, and I don't know why, it's just gotten into me, and I say it every time I talk, that all of you have good stories to tell. All of you have faced obstacles and struggles, whether you choose to ignore them or not, or hang out in the bathtub and soak them off, but they're in you, and they're good stories, and those stories are really, really important for young people. When we've looked at Craig, and I spend far more time in Craig than I do in Steamboat because it's right down the road, and that's one of the highest suicide rates in Colorado, if not the highest. It's also one of the lowest rates of high school graduation, highest rates of teen pregnancy. It's a lot of drugs, Not that Steamboat doesn't have a lot of drugs and a drug problem too, but probably a little more expensive drugs than the ones in Craig. But either way, young people are having a particularly hard time right now. There's a zillion theories why. But some people are really struggling, especially young men, but also young women. And in looking at all of this, the one thing that builds resilience more than anything else are stories. And they're stories that you tell to your neighbors, to your nieces and nephews, to your kids, to your grandkids. those stories are vital. And when they separated out what kind of stories, which of them, so they did 3 categories of stories. Ascending, which is what the Elkheaders always loved, was we started off poor and now we're doing better,
Yeah.
of course. And then came the descending story. We had a homestead and then we lost it, the descending ones. The ones that are most build strength in young people, and probably in ourselves if we let ourselves think about it, are the oscillating ones. That things get rough and you make it through, and then they get a little better, and then they get rough again, and then somebody in your family becomes an alcoholic, somebody gets a miserable divorce, some kid gets sick, you name it, traffic accidents. I mean, there are things that just hit our lives sometimes that we, some people say, well, they deserved it because they were, their lifestyle, blah, 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 blah. Or they could just say, that was a random slam.
Yeah.
Just hit them. But how did you make it through those tough times? How did you pull yourself together after that miserable, violent episode in your life? How did you continue on, And please, if you can, write those stories down or tell them, or both, because those are what is going to build strength in the children that you're around, and the young people that you're around. And of course, if they have the wisdom to come to you and say, whoa, I am flat out depleted, ruined, I know my life is a mess. What did you do when this happened to you? What did you do when you went bankrupt? What did you do when you lost your house? What did you do after that terrible illness or a death of a loved one too soon, or a suicide? Those things you need to share with them. So I come from a family of storytellers, but I just have come to understand that narrative and writing it down, telling it is really important. So I encourage you. And since you're mostly women, I will say I just got this award from Women Writing the West. I'm so excited. I was just like, wow. So yeah, anyway, it's good. It's the Willa Award, and I figure anytime that you get put in the same sentence as Willa Cather, that's like, yeah, great. So, all right, any questions or comments or, yeah.
Well, I have a question and I have a comment. I was talking with someone in another setting, and they were recognized for their philanthropy in the community. And so someone in that audience said, well, how do you know you're a local in your community?
Oh.
And they answered, when you give more than you get. So that was just a food for thought. But the other question I have for you is, do you have another book up your sleeve?
Yeah, what's going on now?
What's coming next? I don't know. I don't know. I have some ideas, but I still have a daughter who hopefully will finish college, and my kids have always come first for me. I've set this book aside so many times because I don't know. A good job is good, but your kids need you, So I'm kind of waiting for her again, because I really had to bear down on this to get it done. Yeah.
We're so glad you did.
Thank you. But it was also those echoes of the people that I'd interviewed, so long ago, who kept I just have all these lovely letters, you know, they write to me in college. So when is the book coming out? I mean, and one of my friends was like, Belle, this isn't a book, this is an epic poem. And then I was really intimidated, like, I can't write a poem, but, you know, it was just way too much.
A lot to shoulder.
Yeah.
How did you find contact with the youth history, the personal history that you brought to the book?
Yeah, by luck and by crook, I guess. So there was a wonderful historian who grew up right on the Ute Reservation, probably in one of those allotments, Floyd O'Neill. He was at the University of Utah. And it was kind of a funny start because he'd written a paper about the Utes' flight to South Dakota, and one of the sites was wrong, just wrong, and it was such a good one, and I wanted to know it. But I also knew that they had a lot in their archives, and I wanted to go through the Doris Day interviews of the Ute people in the 30s and 40s, and well, up to recently. The tobacco eras gave them a lot of money. Anyway, so there's a wonderful collection of photographs and interviews of Ute at that archive. So I went there, and then I talked to Floyd O'Neill, and I was like, sorry, but this footnote is way off. And we went through all his papers, and he couldn't find it. He was an old guy, you know. But he said to me, you need to talk to Venita Tabiapon. And I was like, okay, she's a wonder. So I called her up, and my first question for her actually was, the Bears ears that we have, are they the Bears ears for the northern Colorado Ute? Because over and over, it was all during that time of the Bears Ears National Monument, you know, way down south.
Yeah.
Things were a little confused,
Oh, yeah.
and she was like, oh yeah, absolutely, I come up to California Park to gather OSHA root. She had cancer in remission at that time, but she knew this area, and she knew Steamboat, and she'd been in Rocky Mountain National Park, and I mean, she just, I can't tell you. So, but after she died, I don't feel that I have a contact like that anymore. I think my own sense of it is that the Ute are preoccupied, as well they might be, on that reservation of trying to keep bread and butter together and deal with their businesses and their own I don't know what you would call it, enrichment, upliftment, and culture, and that dealing with some white lady historian who's, you know, trying to dig out documents from the 1880s or something about things that happened, it's not that interesting to them. But we've certainly had a very cooperative arrangement, you know. But I can't say, oh, call, you know, so-and-so, because I don't think they've got the time for it, frankly. Which, you know, that's only 2,000 or 3,000 people in that tribe now, and that's a mixture of, and they've got their own things going on, right? Because that's a mixture of the Yamparica and the Parianuche, right? The Yampa River and the Colorado River Ute that were pushed into Utah and pushed onto a reservation that already had the Uinta Ute on it. They were very different people, and they were very clear about that all through that whole forced migration, basically. That the Utah Ute didn't have horses. They were not horse people. They were like we used to say, or my grandfather would derisively say, low heels, you know, not cowboy boots, just lace-up boots, and dirt people, you know, sod buster type of people. Whereas, you know, we're cattle, livestock people, right? Horses. And the Ute had the same distinction. For some reason, the Utah Ute didn't adopt horses. So that it's still divided. Like you look at the composition of the tribal council today, it's 2 White River Ute, 2 Uinta Ute, and two sort of, blended, who knows what Ute, right? But they've kept the governance divided among the northern Colorado Ute versus the Utah Ute. And they've also, I don't know how they feel about this, but they're the only tribe in the United States that requires 50% or better of Ute blood. And so the unaffiliated Ute, the people who don't have tribal membership, are larger than the tribal membership Ute. And there's constant complaint. They take each other to court. It's not pretty.
They have Indian court, don't they?
But they go to federal court for that because it's about tribal membership and rights of, because as the Ute have become more prosperous with their oil, they own Red Willow Oil and Gas Company, they give out dividends to tribal members, not to the unaffiliated people who are living right next to them. And often families are mixed. And so, they just disinherited, or whatever the right word is. Probably the Catholic Church has a great word for this, when you just excommunicate a whole, 80 Ute, because they decided that the grandmother wasn't actually Ute. She was probably mixed from some other tribe. And so it had gotten diluted enough. And so then all that family took them to court. So they got a lot of stuff going on over there. Of their own.
How much difference was there between the Yampa River and the Colorado River Utes?
Not much, and as I should, geographically, obviously there's a lot of space, but you see these treaties where both are signing, like in Hot Sulphur Springs, and they will name them Yamparica, Parianuche, as in separate bands, but obviously they were intermingling a lot. And that is one attribute, I think, of the Ute that made, in a way, it easier to harm them and remove them, was they were not a warrior culture. They were not Plains Indians. They were not hierarchical. They were pretty darn friendly. And early contacts would describe, I came across this group of Utes and, they offered me sarvice berries and meat. Little did they know, but it of course, well, there's so many, stories sometimes precede the truth and truth sometimes precedes the story or whatever, but there were explorers like Fremont who came and camped along the Yampa, where Elkhead Creek joins the Yampa, and he was all full of, highfalutin, we're about to be attacked, it might be the Shoshone, it probably is the Ute, he could have had who knows out there, the Sioux might have come down just for him. He was full of fear, or he was trying to sell his book, it's hard to know. But they were generally reasonable, sensible people who were living in the mountains and didn't need to deal with a lot of stuff. And they were also fortunate in a way that, like Sand Creek had happened long before contacts here and conflicts here. So there was a little bit more caution on the part of the US government. And at least when horrible things happened, there would be an investigation and there would be testimony. So that, somebody asked me a couple days ago, what are your sources for your historical accounts of the Ute? And it is not exclusively, but a lot is based on first-person testimony. I felt an obligation not to use secondary sources with the Ute, partly because I'd started this project as oral history and interviews, and so I could quote homesteaders, individuals, and I didn't really want to quote other historians,
Sure.
Not to be nice, maybe, but not, it didn't fit. So I went back and got all this testimony from these various incidents that happened to the Ute in this area, including Lily Park, which is a really fascinating that was a Steamboat, deer police, as they were called by the Ute, but it's a sheriff, who gathered up a bunch of people and just decided, well, we'll just head into, and get these people out because they're killing, game. Well, they had permission to get off the reservation, but it was a horrible incident. And many Ute died, women and children died in that. And we need to, I'm working on that, get that acknowledged and maybe something to say what happened here. But those things were, they would, like in that case, everybody went back to the reservation after they'd buried their people up on Douglas Mountain. They went back and the government sent a translator and some really pretty decent folks to gather the testimony and figure out what had actually happened. And that's written up, and each individual's testimony is by their name. I mean, of course, it's going through a translator, but it feels really true. The things they said. The same happened with the allotment process. They held an investigation to hear the Ute and what they felt about the allotment. And they were unanimously against it, but the agent said, I'm sorry, it's going to happen anyway, but I'm going to write down everything you say. And so at least by the time the Utes were in this intense conflict with our white civilization, whatever you want to call it, European civilization, there's been some lessons had been learned, I'd say. Some slight caution had been brought in. But not till like the 90s or something. It's all those Civil War veterans who had nothing better to do. I mean, there is a way to look at the Indian Wars as just being the lack of retirement for Civil War. They got no pension. They got nothing.
Right.
So they all just enlisted in the Indian Wars. Mm-hmm. So because they had nowhere to go and nothing to do.
Yeah.
And so many Civil War veterans were part of that, including the Buffalo Soldiers, or mostly Civil War veterans. Anybody else? Anything? We're at 1:05.
Well, I want to know what your degree is in. What did you end up getting your degree in?
History.
It's history.
Yeah, believe it or not. But it really was history of education. And I focused on the process of rural schools and consolidation. That was really my field at that time.
Very cool.
Yeah.